A very good morning to all of you. Dear friends, please find your seats. We're ready to kick off our last day of the conference. I hope you enjoyed again last night and at least in the morning in a seminar about Russia. We had a very interesting, very lively debate about current temperature, let's say, what is visible in Russia, and we all, I hope, nicely woken up by Russia. And now it's pretty good to go and talk about mainly during this session defense cooperation issues within the European Union, but also as this is very important today when we talk about future defense cooperation within the European Union, also to see how we can enhance cooperation between EU and NATO. The rules are the same like yesterday. We open with panelist discussion, and during the introductory speeches, you could register your interest to speak or to give a comment or to ask our panelist. And we have roughly 1 hour and 30 minutes for discussion during this session. I'm very happy actually to see such a great lineup of panelists this morning to discuss defense and security issues in Europe and among Western allies. On my left, and first whom I give a right to come out with his thoughts on a topic, is, I could call him grand old of Estonian diplomacy, actually. Mr. Jüri LUIK.
Perhaps grand, but not old.
You know, yes, no, of course, not literally, but he is currently Minister of Defense of Estonia. He has been Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs also in last century. At the very beginning of the 90s, he, of course, performed as main negotiator of Estonia to get Russian troops out of our country, early 90s. And Jüri has been also our ambassador to Moscow, Washington, and also our representative at NATO headquarters. Please, Jüri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Marko and Hannes, for this invitation. Let me start by making this general point about EU defense versus current security threats. Now, when you look at the everyday work of the Estonian Defense Ministry, then our current priority is the Zapad exercise. I know that you have discussed Russia already, but I cannot keep myself from saying a couple of words about Zapad, because I deal with this literally every day. And then I go quickly to EU defense and the relationship between current issues and the future of European Union defense. The general comment I would make is that the current threats, although mentioned, for instance, in Claude Juncker's speech as the reason for the need for EU to develop its defense capabilities, cannot be in reality addressed by EU defense capabilities, because they are nascent, still not developed, and both the political chapeau of those military projects as well as practical implementation is still in the very first stages. Now, let me bring you a couple of points from the Zapad front simply to emphasize that there has been a lot of misinterpretation of this event due to Russian counter-propaganda. And the biggest challenge, talking to many outsiders, people who are not well versed in this issue every day, is to explain that Zapad is not one event, but it is a string of events which started from the middle of August. And these exercises are deliberately divided into groups so that they themselves wouldn't be necessarily massive at any given point. In August, Zapad started with moving Russian troops to Belarus. This was called Operation Взаимодействие, which in Russian means cooperation, for those who don't speak Russian. And of course, I'm not sure how much it is a cooperation, or perhaps it's more kind of simply moving to Belarus and, for instance, not leaving Belarus, which is also a possibility. It is still part of the Zapad exercise. And finally, which is already in the beginning of October, there will be a Zapad exercise which will be training the Russian nuclear triad, which might be, from the global point of view, one of the very serious bits and pieces of the exercise. There are huge training grounds, Russian training grounds close to Estonia and Estonian border. So we are deeply concerned that Russia, which is already in serious breach of all Vienna confidence-building commitments, has raised to the, well, battle footing divisions of troops, brought them to the training grounds, and the warning period for instance, Estonian or NATO defense forces is very, very small, very short. Luckily, there is a very strong symbolic presence of NATO troops on the Estonian territory, British troops, French troops, Hungarian troops. And the US contingent will also be arriving very soon, to make a very clear point. So we hope that will be an important deterrence. Now, what is the relevance to all of this to EU? I think EU operates as a political measure to make a point to our Russian neighbors that the Western community has a huge plethora of means to deter aggression. And one of those deterrences is also, of course, economic deterrence. And, for instance, the sanctions policy, which is used in Ukraine. But the EU defense itself is still starting up. There is a huge political enthusiasm, but the actual moves are still, I would say, relatively in the first stages. Let me give you a couple of examples or a couple of points here. People speak about PESCO, which essentially, and for political reasons we don't use that term, which essentially is a defense union. The word PESCO is, of course, horrible. I mean, it puts you to sleep even before you start the analysis of this phenomenon. Basically, as you know, PESCO is the project where countries who have a deeper interest in defense cooperation would come together politically and make a number of commitments, both in terms of development of military capabilities and presence in operations. PESCO, as you know, has not been created yet. So in the Defense Ministerial, which we discussed, which just ended a couple of days ago here in Tallinn, we discussed how to constitute this organization. The general view among defense ministers was that as many countries as possible should join, that there shouldn't be criteria which would make it difficult for the PESCO countries to join. But everybody also admitted that when it comes to practical operations, it is unavoidable that this will be concluded, these will be conducted by a smaller group of countries. So we are talking about PESCO, I would still call it defense union, although it's not politically correct, on two stages. The political chapeau, as many countries as possible, and as I said, countries are indicating that they are ready to join, with clear exceptions like Great Britain because of Brexit and Denmark because of opt-out policy. And then there would be smaller groups for any particular project or any particular operation. Now, EU is a bit shaky in moving to the defense sphere because, as you know, according to the treaties, it is not foreseen that EU deals with defense. This is intergovernmental matter. And EU is trying to find smart ways to, I wouldn't say go into contradiction with its founding treaties, but sort of find areas where we could commonly operate or commonly use the strength of the European Union to create more defense capabilities. And one of those tools is the European Defense Fund, which will be operated by the European Commission and which will be giving financial support from the common budget to both military research and creation of military capabilities. In fact, an Estonian diplomat from our defense ministry is now leading the working group which is putting together this document, a founding paper of how such a defense fund will be operating. But in the EU Commission, this is all under the Vice President dealing with jobs and investment, because EU has no sort of specific pillar on the Commission side which would deal with defense issues. So even inside the European Union, we should have a debate what structures and how both political structures, bureaucratic structures, military structures would actually be carrying this defense policy which we want to develop. So concluding, I would say, in conclusion, I would say, we are just starting. There's great enthusiasm. There's a lot to do, and we shouldn't put initially enormous expectation into what people sometimes say, solving Russia issue or Syria issue or something else. Let's be very realistic about where we stand with EU defense. Thanks.
Thank you, Jüri. And we move on. Yesterday already we started our discussions about Europe's role in the world and also the unity among Western allies. Western unity as such is very difficult to imagine without good cooperation between vital institutions of the West, including NATO and the European Union. And I'm very happy to give a floor now to Ambassador Tacan ILDEM, who directs NATO Public Diplomacy Division that works to raise the alliance's profile with audiences around the world to build understanding of and support for NATO's policies and operations. He's a distinguished Turkish diplomat. He has held bilateral and multilateral positions, including ambassador to Netherlands and permanent representative to NATO and the OSCE. Please, Ambassador.
Well, first of all, it is such a pleasure for me to be here before distinguished members of national parliaments from EU countries and also members of European Parliament, and joining such a distinguished group of panelists. We are in a very complex and really challenging security environment, and both NATO and EU face these unprecedented security challenges emanating from the East and the South, and that need to have a concerted and complementary way to work together. And the overall goal of NATO and EU remains the same: maintain peace and stability and promote security for our citizens. The importance of a strong transatlantic bond based on shared values which enhances our common security and ensures a fair and balanced burden sharing is more important than ever for our security considerations. 22 out of 29 allied nations are also EU members. But nations only have one single set of forces. And in this regard, we welcome closer and mutually reinforcing cooperation between the European Union and NATO. Together, the two organizations, unique and essential partners, can mobilize the available tools to deal with those challenges that both are facing. During the Warsaw Summit meeting last July in Warsaw, it was possible for the leadership of NATO and the European Union, NATO Secretary General, and also presidents of the Council and the Commission could be able to sign a joint declaration, which, as we see it, elevated our cooperation to a different new level. Our cooperation is not a matter of choice, but it is a necessity, and it is becoming a norm rather than an accidental engagement. When both organizations signed this joint declaration, a very important preparatory work was later on undertaken to determine areas of cooperation which we can sharpen our capacities. And in that sense, we were able to come up with 42 common proposals in the areas vital for both organizations to tackle, like hybrid threats, operational cooperation including maritime issues, cybersecurity and defense, defense capabilities, defense industry and research, exercises, and defense and security capacity building. I must also say that both sides are determined to have a proper focus on the implementation of these measures. Twice a year we have progress reports presented by the Secretary General to the North Atlantic Council, and High Representative Mogherini to the EU side, and also to come up with new ideas how we can find new areas of cooperation to further our strategic partnership. During the meeting of the defense ministers, NATO defense ministers, on the 29th of June, High Representative also attended that meeting, and there was a very good discussion on how we can enhance the role of NATO in fight against terrorism, but also ways for both organizations to cooperate in an efficient way in dealing these challenges. We, of course, see new developments taking place, discussions taking place in the European Union side, and we know the autonomy of the decision-making of both organizations. What we all agree is that it should be guided by principles of complementarity and avoiding duplication. And I think both organizations are careful in that. When we look at the global strategy of the European Union, it says that when it comes to collective defense, NATO remains the primary framework. And in the words of President Juncker, he considers NATO to be cornerstone of European security. We are at NATO side determined to continue with this partnership relationship in reaching and covering important areas. And it is a very good example that NATO Secretary General was present at the meeting of EU defense ministers, and he also attended as an observer attended the exercise, cyber exercise that Estonian presidency organized. And we are looking forward to the European Union to participate in a NATO-led exercise on cyber defense next month. Few words on Zapad, perhaps. Indeed, it is an issue that is in the radar screen of NATO allies. We had NATO-Russia Council meeting before the summer break, and the Russian colleagues shared some information on Zapad. But according to the information, it was portrayed as if the troop numbers participating in exercise was below the threshold of 13,000, which requires proper reporting to within the context of Vienna document. The past experience and all relevant information suggests that it would go far beyond 13,000, and we will be calm but still vigilant in monitoring this exercise. And we keep on urging the Russian Federation to get engaged in Vienna at the OSCE for the modernization of the Vienna document and comply with all the stipulations of these commitments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now let me turn to the last panelist, last but not least, of course, Mr. Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden. During his term as a Prime Minister, his government negotiated and signed accession agreement with the European Union. And at the time when he was a Foreign Minister, he was one of initiators of EU's Eastern Partnership, but he has taken also many posts on international level, international functions. He was a co-chair of the Dayton peace talks on Bosnia and was also the first High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And very good to have you, Carl, here with us. And as a free thinker right now, what is your take? Are we going in the right direction when we're talking about European defense?
I don't know. Because I think the debate is heading off in several different directions. First, I think the debate is good. It's a subject that needs to be on the agenda. It's a new subject to some extent at least, and accordingly it's hardly surprising that it's somewhat all over the place. I mean, that comes with the issue. Just a couple of reflections on it from my side. First, what is European defense? I mean, that's the first question. And I think you can divide it into two rather separate sets of issues. One is the defense of Europe, the territorial defense. And as pointed out, that can't be an EU function. That can't be done without NATO. The most significant thing that has been done in terms of the defense reassurance of Europe lately has been the NATO deployments in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. And if you look at that, there is a UK responsibility for the battalion battle group here in Estonia. There's a Canadian responsibility in Latvia. There's a German in Lithuania, highly important. That's an EU country. And there's an American in Poland. So out of those 4, there's only 1 EU. The rest are non-EU. And that sort of indicates that here we can't do without NATO. EU itself will never be able to do it. And there are also, of course, other things that the EU can't do. There's a nuclear component, extended deterrence to the defense of Europe, Western Europe, that we seldom talk about, but that the Russians talk about. And since the Russians do, we have to be aware of it more than we are. There is command and control facilities, which NATO has, you might say, probably too much of those still. But you can't do anything without that command and control structure that is there. What will be needed if we are to, hopefully not, enter into crisis of that sort, an Article 5, as they call it in the NATO word, it will simultaneously be a 42.7 issue in the EU. And we need to think through how you merge the Article 5 and the Article 42.7 processes. And I think you have to think through de facto when you war game those particular issues. You end up in what I call a NACFAC very fast. The North Atlantic Council and the Foreign Affairs Council of Defense Ministers essentially will have to be merged for running Article 5 and 42.7 operations at the same time. Second aspect, apart from the territorial defense, is of course the military component of common foreign and security policy. And that is, I would say, equally important. If we are going to be a player on regional and global security, we must be able to have a military component of that policy as well. And that's a question of capabilities as well as will. On capabilities, we are about to run into a very major problem, and that is, of course, Brexit. 1/4 of EU defense spending is the UK. 1/4 of EU defense spending is the UK. That will disappear from the EU structures. If you talk about deployable assets, I would argue that is probably more than 1/4. That is the UK. So we will, if we look at it in these terms, face a very significant decline in the capabilities immediately available within the EU structures unless we structure the relationship with the UK the one way or the other. They also have headquarters facilities that we use at the moment, both for the Atalanta and for the Sofia operations, and they have also other capabilities that are. So that needs to be sorted out. I think it's one of the key issues on capabilities is to sort out. Also other countries, by the way, the biggest troop contributor to our biggest land operation happens to be Turkey, which, as is well known, is not an EU member country either. So in capabilities, we need to have a discussion on how we structure those relationships. Then we have, which has been subject of a lot of attention from the Commission side, the more industrial, defense industrial base side. I've been involved in taking forward the proposal on the research thing, which I think will be okay. I'm still somewhat skeptical on some of the things that I hear coming and see coming out of the Commission on coordination of defense industries, because if you look at it, even that is somewhat complicated. We do have good examples of defense industrial cooperation producing impressive projects. The Meteor air-to-air missile is the best in the world. I mean, it's superior to anything the Americans are even in the vicinity of. And that's a European collaborative project. We have other ones, NH90, to take one example, that is miserable in terms of both cost and time, performance eventually will be good, I guess. So the experience of these joint projects is, to put it very mildly, mixed, more on the downside than on the upside, and that needs to be taken in consideration. And also here we have the defense industrial base. I would argue that the best example that we have is MBDA, that makes missiles, or tactical missiles, where I would argue that Europe is better than the US with what we've done there. Meteor is only one example of that. That's nearly 40% UK. And the rest divided between sort of Airbus and an Italian component. How do we handle that within the context of the European Defence Fund and other things? That needs to be sorted out. And we do see still a lot of nationalism on these particular issues. You see what happened just sort of a couple of weeks ago with Italy, Fincantieri, buying a shipyard in France, and the LEC panel is blocking it on some sort of national security grounds. We can't trust the Italians to have naval shipyards in France. Well, if that is the attitude, where do we head with that? Then I think the biggest issue, I would say, isn't the territorial defense and isn't the capabilities, but is the strategic will. Does Europe have the strategic will to use military power? Is it ready to demonstrate that it's able to use military power? And here, of course, strategic cultures in the different countries are very different indeed. It will take quite some time for them to be able to merge so as to be able to run operations. In 1999, we had the Helsinki headline goals. One should have the ability to deploy 60,000 troops. That was quite something. Nothing came of that. We set up the battle groups. They've been there, and formally speaking, they are still there. I give 10 euros if there's anyone in the room who can give me the names of the nations that supply the battle groups as, at this, Jüri is excluded because he should know. If we can supply the names of the nations that are having the battle group at the moment, they are virtually forgotten, but they are there. And the fact that we have never deployed them, and I've been through X numbers of discussions in the Foreign Affairs Councils, when I see people say, no, we can't use them here, we can't use them, it's too expensive, it's too complicated, and issues or situations where they should have been used, and we have not even been able to exercise them. There hasn't been in 10 years a single exercise of deploying the battle groups, of demonstrating what they are and what they can do. And this is, I think, where we should start. Before we go on with sort of theoretical schemes of sort of stratospheric proportions, demonstrate that we can actually use what we have and that we got the strategic will. Organize a couple of exercises of the battle groups, do some wargaming of scenarios that are relevant both for EU and together with NATO, and then I think move it from there. Because if you look at concrete situations and concrete deployments, then you see the gaps in capabilities and the gaps in command and control that are there to be filled, and work it from the operational angle rather than from the theoretical, and if I look at the Commission, somewhat too much defense industrial angle that are doing at the moment, where I think you end up wasting money rather than in creating capabilities.
Thank you very much for all the three.
Muchísimas gracias a los tres por estas presentaciones de introducción sobre este tema tan importante. Puedo ser generoso ahora con el tiempo esta mañana, espero.
Speaking request will at least initially
Por lo menos en principio, Toda solicitud de intervención dispondrá de minuto y medio. Pero vamos a agrupar, eso sí, las preguntas en 2 o 3 oradores al mismo tiempo para que pueda responder a más preguntas. Y no individualmente. Representante del Parlamento Europeo, Sabine Lösing, tiene la palabra. Gracias. Nos preguntamos, ¿cómo fortalecer la defensa europea? Bien. Yo creo que la pregunta correcta sería cómo mejorar la seguridad. Yo creo, sin embargo, que tenemos que darnos cuenta de que no hemos alcanzado todavía una situación en que se pueda mejorar la seguridad en nuestra vecindad. La vecindad, me permito recordar que no solamente la oriental. ¿La OTAN ha contribuido a esta realidad? Yo creo que sí. La reconstrucción neoliberal y la política comercial injusta, la integración de regiones en Europa, pues ha dado lugar al final a una serie de conflictos de todas las fuerzas. En lugar de cambiar la política y los paradigmas, parece que se trata de tratar con los conflictos desde el punto de vista militar solo. Sí, se dijo ayer, somos tan ricos. Pues bien, en ese caso, si somos ricos, hay que fortalecer la defensa europea. ¿Pero acaso no es así? Si no fuéramos tan ricos, ¿no deberíamos estar en una situación contraria si fuéramos más pobres? No reforzar la lógica militar en lugar de reforzar las agencias, sino establecer una agencia
arms control and global justice and so on. Yes, we have to invest in security, but sustainable investment in security is different from the expansion of military structures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the second question for this is Tunne Kelam from the European Parliament.
Aitäh. Thank you very much. I think all our efforts must not be seen as a substitute to maintaining and increasing transatlantic cooperation on security, because it's very good to have now interest and some will to increase European defense capabilities. But what we have is just the June Defense Action Plan. I repeat, plan. And what we need, as usual, is implementation that is really increasing of defense capabilities. So my question is about 2% defense expenditure. Should it be a commitment also for non-NATO EU members first? Because we are speaking about pooling and harmonizing defense efforts, but it's actually our biggest problem. It has to be solved. And once again, it can't be an excuse for meeting the 2% level. Second, my question is about we need a European capability and armaments policy that is just about to create competitive defense industrial base. And my third question is possibility of the need to create in the European Commission a DG for defense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And not in any particular order, but I will now pass these two or three questions and comments to the panelists. Carl, perhaps.
Well, I could ask Sabine Lösing's questions. I mean, you need, in my opinion, you need to have a military component. You need to be ready to have a military component of our external policies. But the external policies, of course, has primarily a lot of other components. When I was foreign minister, one of the things that I took initiative to, and we eventually did, although it's outside the EU framework formally, is the European Institute for Peace, which does sort of discrete mediation work in different conflicts around the world. And clearly we need to invest much more in those diplomatic capabilities as well. It's not the one or the other, apart from the fact that the agenda of this particular session is more the defense. It's not to the exclusion of all of the other things.
Please.
Well, if I may pick up the question related to 2% defense spending, this was a major discussion item during the Heads of State and Government meeting on 25th of May. And NATO leaders had an informal but very useful discussion on that. We may recall that in 2014, during the Wales summit meeting, NATO allies agreed to reach 2% GDP target by 2020. And since then, when we look at the numbers, it was possible to stop the declining spending in defense. And in 2015 and 16, we saw increases in defense spending. Right now, we may say that overall increase in defense spending has been 4.3% in the last 3 years. And we are, of course, gratified to see this change. And we all have to recognize that dealing with the complexities of the security challenges requires investment in our security. It also requires, perhaps, to have the support of our publics, and we need to enlighten the complexities that we face in the security field, and proper investments could be made. Yesterday, I was heartened by the presentations made during the meeting, especially by the High Representative, Madame Mogherini, regarding the European Defense Fund, the capabilities question. And from NATO side, we see these developments positive. When there is more European defense spending with more capabilities, it is not only good for European Union, but for NATO as well.
Jüri, please.
Thank you. I would pick up on both the first question and Tunne's question on EU's defense spending. On the first issue, I agree with colleagues who said that EU actually has a comprehensive array of tools to be used, except for the military tools, which EU has used very sparingly and very carefully. It's more stability operations rather than kinetic operations or combat operations. And obviously, EU is giving huge economic assistance and humanitarian assistance to a number of crisis areas. So I think there is some type of a synergy which helps us to guarantee the stability or enhance stability in those regions. On the other hand, let's be honest about it. I mean, we still have the memory of Rwanda. And you would ask yourself, everybody should ask themselves, even EU capabilities would have been enough to stop some of the bloodshed. The combat capabilities in this civil war were minuscule. I mean, we could have easily done something about it. Now, millions are dead. We can say it was the business of the Rwandans. They have to sort it all out. Or with Gaddafi, in terms of Gaddafi's troops approaching Benghazi. Now, Gaddafi said he will raise Benghazi to the ground. I mean, there is a possibility to say it's not our business. But you might also say that if you are a responsible person who has capabilities in stopping such a bloodshed, should you do something? I have no easy answers, and these questions will be decided separately in all circumstances. But I don't think it's an easy solution. We shouldn't interfere anywhere. Let people kill each other. It's not our problem. This is their right to do that. So I think there is an issue to be taken into consideration. I very much support the idea that EU countries If we want serious defense, we should raise the defense budgets of all countries, because these budgets together create the critical mass of improving our defense capabilities. You can do only so much by economizing and saying we do stuff jointly, etc., etc. You should still put real money in. And although Commission is promising to put 1.5 billion euros every year from 2020, even this is small money compared to what is necessary to develop new capabilities in terms of arms, for instance. Commission can help, but our spending is still, our defense spending is still our defense spending. Whether we need a new DG, I doubt. But I think the DGs who deal with these issues should have a strong military advisory component, because as every military person here in the room knows, military planning is more mathematics than politics. You have to actually know what capabilities you need, what enablers you need, what is the transport, what is the medevac, etc., etc. You actually have to know this stuff to address it properly. So I think a military advisory component is necessary in the commissions.
Thank you, Jüri. And now we go to the next two speakers, and first is from European Parliament, Mr. Urmas Paet. Please, Urmas.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, I don't think that development or creating defense union is so much about enthusiasm. I think it's, of course, mainly about political willingness and understandings, what's really happening, which is the security situation in Europe and in our immediate neighborhood. I remember when I started preparing European Parliament's Defence Union report a bit more than a year ago, and the level of skepticism was very high. It was high among different, well, even political groups, but also especially in the member states. During last year, a lot has happened, and the attitude has changed quite tremendously. And that's why I also see that during this Estonia's presidency, one of the most important issues it is defense union and how far we can get before the end of our presidency with defense union. So that I hope that before January, next concrete steps will be decided. But well, I still wonder, also from your point of view, from ministerial meetings, but also for independent think tankers, which are at this stage still the concrete negative arguments also of member states against moving forward with defense union, although from rational point of view we all understand that we have to use all our capabilities to be ready for even further negative changes in our security environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Urmas. And now also from European Parliament, Mr. Michael Gahler, please.
Aitäh. Lugupeetud härra minister, am I wrong in when I have a bit the feeling that you are driving on European defense with a kind still of a pulled handbrake a bit? But I would like to encourage you to see more, well, to describe well the obstacles and the difficulties that we are in. And also Carl has eloquently described it. I recall him in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to see that they exist, these battle groups you said years ago. You're right, and it's you alluded to that. My question is first, you want a low threshold to enter the PESCO by the end of the year. Does it correspond to a low level of ambition to make it possible? When we look at the different things where we have neither proceeded, neither in NATO nor in the EU, for instance, what about having a rule in the EU implementing a decision from December 2013, European Council saying we want to have security of supply inside the EU only? It was secretively buried at some point. Could we not work on that? Certifications, all civil certifications are mutually recognized throughout the EU, not in the military field. Is that not an option for the EU to work on that military certification? Military Schengen, a good term when we have exercised. It's so difficult for soldiers and a lot of bureaucracy involved when they move through several countries. Should that not be a concrete project? And these are only some of those things, I think, where we can substantially on the EU side contribute. And the last question, what about having an EU involvement in Bosnia in case our special friend Mr. Dodik calls a second referendum to break up Bosnia? Do you think Trump will come over and help us out? I think we must be prepared for that. And insofar, we need some more efficient structures in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. Perhaps, Jüri, you could start.
Okay. When it comes to PESCO, or let's say Defense Union, then I think there is a great enthusiasm among countries. But judging from the last ministerial, I have to say that countries approach this project from very different angles. Some countries emphasize the value of integration of this project to EU in general, that we have lost or losing a member, etc., and we would need another integration project. Some countries are mostly interested in the industrial part of it, funds for arms industry, to put it more bluntly. Some countries are interested in conducting a particular operation and drawing in other EU countries for this operation. So I think our aim is to try to reconcile, and these are not irreconcilable differences. Our aim is to reconcile these differences and to actually try to do all of them. I think it is possible, but I think it is also very important not to force the issue, but to negotiate with countries so that the general framework of PESCO will be as inclusive as possible. Now, when it is constituted and when we have more basis for, which has been mentioned here before, the military culture, the kind of defense culture for the EU, I think the ambition will go up quite quickly. But we shouldn't demand people committing to a very complicated project from the outset, because I think it will be quite difficult. There are projects already which have wide support, and one of them is military Schengen, you mentioned, and this is useful also for NATO, because it's so complicated nowadays to move military units from one EU country to another, starting from bureaucratic limitations, ending with logistical problems, that it's simply ridiculous. It takes days and days and days even to get permits to cross the border, although we are all allies in EU, in NATO. It's quite ridiculous. So I think this is the project where there is wide interest, although the word Schengen is not popular everywhere inside the European Union. But I think this project might be. So I wouldn't say that we shouldn't be ambitious, but I think we should try to be as realistic as possible, because the past EU defense projects have all died on unrealistic ambition. As Carl said, Helsinki criteria, 60,000 men. It's absolutely unrealistic, absolutely. So if you put such a criteria up there, then you know already from the beginning that you're actually not able to achieve that. Thanks.
Thank you, and please, Ambassador, and then Carl.
Well, of course, I cannot be able to contribute to the discussions relevant for the European Union, but insofar as NATO is concerned, when we talk about the contributions of allied nations, we are not focusing only the cash aspect of 2%. The contributions should be, in addition to cash, capabilities and also contributions to operations and missions that NATO undertakes. When we recall the Wales Summit decision, it was referring to 2% GDP, but also 20% new technology equipment. And I think it would be essential to pursue ways to strengthen all of our capabilities. And when it comes to efforts between NATO and EU, the golden word would be complementarity. Now, a few words on military Schengen, and I agree with Jüri that the word Schengen perhaps is not that well embraced. In any case, the idea is a good one, and at NATO we are also focusing on that insofar as aligning the legislative and the bureaucratic arrangements, but also to tackle the logistical aspects of the question. A few words on Western Balkans. I think more and more NATO and EU should join forces in having an enhanced presence and elevated engagement with the countries of the region, and also tackle strategic communication aspects of the matter with certain progress achieved in the aspirations, Euro-Atlantic and European aspirations of individual countries, because there are certain unfinished business that have to be attended, and we both organizations should encourage those countries who have such aspirations to integrate in Euro-Atlantic European structures.
Thank you, Carl.
To be concrete, following what Michael said, sort of Bosnia we do have. I mean, the biggest EU land operation is Altea, is 600 people. An Austrian general commanding Turkish troops, which has its particular peculiarities these days, and reinforcement planning that is very impressive. But what we could do, well, they're exercising it there, but I would suggest exercise the battle group to reinforce. Because among the most complicated things with military operations is just deployment. You have to get that particular troop from God knows, no one has taken up my 10 euros, by the way, get that particular battalion group from somewhere to there, by rail or sea or whatever, exceedingly complicated. If you don't exercise this, there is no credibility that you will be able to do it. So do that. Another thing which I think one should look at, just to illustrate what I think we should be able to do in order to be a credible player. One of the biggest catastrophes that we are facing at the moment is Yemen. 30 million people, cholera, complete breakdown on nearly everything. I'm not saying that we should intervene and solve everything there, because we can't do it. But humanitarian supplies is dependent on the port of Hodeidah. That's controlled by the Houthis. The Saudis and Emiratis are threatening to take over because they think that other things are coming in. Security Council has said, don't do it, someone needs to control the port. Should EU have the capabilities to go in and seize the port and secure it for humanitarian supplies? I mean, that's a sort of mission that I think the EU should be both willing and capable of doing. Are we willing to do it? It's not even discussed. Are we capable of doing it with the present capabilities? Well, one should be able to look at it. These are the sort of situations in the extended near abroad of Europe where we should be able to intervene also in our interest. If we have a complete breakdown of Yemen, those refugee flows will hit us as well as hit others.
Well, I'm now going to proceed to the next two speakers. From Lithuania, the first one, Laurinas Kasčiūnas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to get back to the question which you raised in the beginning. It's are we in a good direction in creating the European defense? European Commission proposed three scenarios for European defense 2025. Analytics is saying that at least two of them, second and third, has the potential and risk to duplicate NATO. So here is my questions. My question and Lithuanian position. It would be good that you could comment a little bit. So the changing nature of transatlantic relationship does not necessarily should mean less America in Europe. Vice versa. It should mean more Europe in NATO and more balanced transatlantic burden sharing. That's why Europe should concentrate more on increase of defense spending, but not on creation of structures which could duplicate NATO. Second point, it is necessary to strengthen the cooperation between EU and NATO, in particular in the following areas: response to hybrid and cyber threats, the fight against terrorism. The role of NATO is to ensure collective defense. The role of the EU is to protect Europe, to build up the resilience from foreign influence, not only in the cyber sphere, but also in energy and other sectors. EU should find added value in the relations with NATO. Both organizations must complement each other rather than duplicate their efforts. And third point is about PESCO. We need to avoid two-speed Europe. We do not need new dividing lines between EU member states. That's why this policy should be inclusive and not exclusive one. And it's a final question, just what kind of, how you see the finalité of EU defense policy and EU defense union or PESCO? Thank you.
Next speaker from the European Parliament, Bodil Valera, please.
Thank you. I think it was very clear in the discussion where the limits are, are the member states doing and what can the European Union do according to the treaty. But we also have a situation where, for example, in the European Parliament, there are strong voices for much more than what we can do according to the treaty. So I think that was very clear, good that you mentioned it. I would like to know if there are any discussions in the Council on treaty changes. I think that's a very dangerous way to go in a moment where Euroscepticism is growing and we have other difficult situation within countries in the European Union, so just to know if this is a discussion. Then I come to the situation, what Carl Bildt spoke about, that it could be the defense fund, it could be a waste of money, because I believe it could be a waste of money. Anyway, it has to be taken from somewhere else, some other urgent areas, as development or research, etc. So that could be a waste of money, really, the defense fund. But you said you were skeptical to the coordination and cooperation between the different countries in the arms industry and so on, for example. I believe that the coordination and cooperation could also save a lot of money that could be used instead of having new money for development or research and so on. You could save that money just cooperating and use the money, but because we have a lot of other threats also that we need research on, threats to our citizens, it's not military threats, but climate change, we need to address it. We need high technology, and the defense industry, they have it. Mostly, we need a lot of things. So we have to be smarter. So we can use other money. I think this is a waste of money anyway, so thank you.
Thank you. And now to the panelists. Jüri, if you want to start, please.
Yes. Well, to comment on this ideal state of EU defense is obviously extremely difficult. I totally agree with Carl that the military structures are designed by operations. If you look at NATO and Afghanistan, for instance, Afghanistan operations started to design how NATO was operating what weapons were designed, what training was given. Now when we have to go back to collective defense quickly, it comes out that we often don't have the, for instance, heavy armor or sophisticated communication system, which you would need if you are opposing a serious state actor enemy. But I very much agree that, that operations are what defines the joint defense organizations and capabilities, and that's why I think it is important that the political will to take up an operation would be exercised. Because if you have an organization which main aim is deterrent, then you can actually allow tanks to stand in the bases. They still deter. But if you have these smaller stabilization operations, which will be the purview of the European Union unavoidably for a long time to come, you actually need to do it to achieve something, to achieve credibility. And coming to this example, Carl's example about the port in Yemen, we have to keep in mind that we are not talking only about the joint EU capabilities. Every country, EU country, has its own capabilities, which are not declared under EU, but which are possible to be used in an operation. So we should also look at the EU military capabilities in totality, not only, let's say, a battle group. Yes, a battle group is. Treaty changes, I wouldn't advocate them. Nobody wants it. It's by far too complicated. But treaty has possibilities, even as we speak, to define them in a way that you can do a lot of things without changing the treaty. When you do a joint project, then theoretically, like a weapons project, theoretically it should be more economical. But you have to keep in mind that the joint project is extremely complicated. We are not talking about states here. We are talking about private firms. States don't build planes. These are built by the private enterprises who have their own rules and interests. And you would then have to go to a weapons market, which is also a very complicated animal. Most of the buyers are states. Almost all of the buyers are states. So politics comes in. So the sort of the simple logic that if we do more together, it's probably more economical, doesn't necessarily work in actual circumstances always. I'm not against doing things jointly. I'm simply pointing out that there are aspects which have to be taken into consideration.
Carl.
No, just to reinforce that point that Jüri is making, which I think is very important, because when I read the Commission document, they seem to believe that once you do it between two nations, it's going to be better and cheaper. Well, it could be, if it's driven by a very hard-nosed operational requirement. Take Meteor as an example. That was driven by us finding out, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that the Soviets were far ahead of us in air-to-air combat, far ahead. They could take us out of the skies before we were even aware of it. So a sense of urgency, but it took 15 years to get a missile that could handle that particular threat. But it was an acute, urgent operational requirement that produced the Meteor. It wasn't some sort of industrial design. While there have been other cases, if I look at aircrafts, which we have examples in Europe, both of multinational programs and national programs, I would argue that the most impressive fighters is the Swedish Gripen and the French Rafale, purely national programs, while the multinational programs are somewhat less impressive. And I think the explanation is what Jüri mentioned. That is not an argument against trying. but it's an argument against being hard-nosed in the evaluation of it and have it driven by operational requirements. Then also to stress the point that Jüri made, that you should look, we have assets that we can use. To take two examples from the Swedish point of view, I don't remember when it was, I think it was 15 years ago by now, we, at the request of the UN, together with the French, sent special forces to the DRC, to Congo, to sort out some particular issues. That had never been done before, and eventually that led to increased cooperation between special forces. Some years later, we had a request, EU had a request from the UN to facilitate the deployment of a mission in Chad. Well, Chad was not a country that we knew very much about it, but we ended up from the Swedish side as part of the EU mission that was commanded from an old fortification outside of Paris, sending an amphibious warfare unit to Sahara. Who had thought of that before? But that particular operation by the EU actually was successful. We prevented something that could have happened. We facilitated the deployment of a UN force that was also successful, and demonstrated that we can do things. But we learned a lot in the process of both what we need, what we could do, and what we couldn't do. So that reinforced the point. By doing things, you demonstrate will, and you learn what capabilities you actually need. It's not something that you produce behind a desk in Brussels. It's in the sort of, it's in the mud of the Balkans or the sand of the Sahara or in the seas of the Gulf of Aden that you really get the requirements that you need to fulfill.
Ambassador, please.
I will comment on the observations and questions from Mr. Kasčiūnas from Lithuania on the need to cooperate between NATO and the European Union on hybrid, cyber, and counter-terrorism. In fact, since spring of last year, NATO and EU are implementing and operationalizing their playbooks, parallel playbooks that they develop on these areas, hybrid and cyber, which covers situational awareness, European Union Intelligence Fusion Cell, and also the new intelligence division that we created at NATO with also hybrid fusion center. They interact with each other. We have hybrid bulletins for the awareness increasing of all members and to take necessary actions. Strategic communications is also falling into that domain. More and more we encounter disinformation and propaganda, which requires proper and timely analysis and monitoring, coming up with proper information environment assessments to compare notes and to also strengthen our resilience in different ways in analyzing and also debunking some of the myths circulating in the information space. The hybrid Center of Excellence of the European Union in Helsinki will be participated by the European Union nations, but also by NATO allies to strengthen our capacities in dealing with different forms of hybrid actions. On cyber, I have already touched upon the ways that we can cooperate. And after the meeting of the heads of state and government of NATO countries on the 24th of May, it became clear that elevating cooperation in the fight against terrorism would be something that we would be focusing more in the months ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I see that we have roughly 12-13 minutes left to the end of this session. Let me take all 4 requested questions, and first I'll ask Mr. Raymond Hoon from Netherlands.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. BILDT, and I hope the Turkish ambassador can reflect on the issue as well. My question is about PESCO. PESCO will be open for participation by non-EU members, and in all documents I saw, the obvious examples of Norway and Britain after Brexit are mentioned. But what about Turkey? What if present-day Turkey would say, we want to participate in PESCO projects? Should PESCO doors be wide open for Turkey? Or should PESCO doors be categorically closed? Should we tell that to Turkey? Or should these doors be ajar, meaning should they be open under certain conditions? Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Paolo Aili from Italy. Please, Paolo.
Thank you. A remark on the question. Well, the debate on defense and security is very good, of course. We have NATO. We have to start from NATO. Cooperation between NATO and the EU is very good, as also Ambassador ILDEM mentioned regarding the 42 common initiatives. NATO has also demonstrated the capacity of adaptation. I think that the inauguration just a few days ago of the strategic direction south in Naples is a very important political decision from NATO regarding the southern flank of the alliance. But I think that there is a conceptual difference between NATO and EU common defense. NATO is a collective defense. We defend each individual country which will be attacked by enemies. European common defense should have the ambition of defending the common borders, but this means that if we recognize that we have common borders, we recognize that inside those borders there is the Federation of the United States of Europe. And like Alcide de Gasperi said 70 years ago, that would be the real way to build a political union, European Union, and I think that there is still a long way to go. The question is on burden sharing, very easy. Should it be only money or investments, or should we try to measure also the real outcomes? There are countries spending more than 2% but not giving a significant contribution to collective defense, and other vice versa. And should we consider also new parameters as security changes very much in time, or shall we stay on the same parameters which we use now to measure the investments? For example, migration.
Thank you, Paolo. And the next one is Mr. Carlos Costaneves from Portugal, please.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my opinion that NATO is and will be essential for European defense, that we must avoid duplication, we have to combine, we have to match, and I like to say that European defense is a European pillar of NATO. One question. Paragraph 14 of Wales Summit Declaration about the burden sharing and about the target of 2% and 20% in investment. What do you think about this declaration and about this conclusion? Do you think that is a clear financial commitment? Do you think that is a momentary political objective? Do you think that is a merely indicative to reverse a trend from decrease to increase? And linked to this question also, I think it's very clear the sign that we are not going to achieve this objective. What do you think about the consequences for the cohesion of European Union and NATO, for the vitality of our defense, and to the credibility of our commitments? Thank you.
Thank you. And I see we have still two speakers, please. This is the end of now. I close the line. And Mrs. Marianne Mikko, please, from Estonia.
Thank you very much. That has been... I'm here. That has been extremely interesting morning session. Coming to EU defense, there is no European army because of member states are not on the level of understanding of importance of 2% of defense expenditure. that has said by some EU politicians. Of course, that is not the main reason. I fully agree with Carl Bildt, that that is a question of will, strategic will. Now, optimist and true believer in EU defense is asking, what is in your panelists, of your opinion of those obstacles, why we have not EU defense, why we must do to get over and to make it. But in the same time, there is skepticism in me, because we have NATO. We have extremely wonderful defense organization with very good Article 5. So, isn't it still too costly and luxurious to have EU military wing for what we need for, if a lot of, not to mention almost all members of EU are in NATO? So a waste of time, energy, and yeah, that was my question. Thanks.
Thank you, Marianne. And the last speaker in this session from colleagues is Mr. Pierre-Alexandre Anglade from France. Please.
Thank you very much. I will be brief. I have two remarks because I didn't intend to speak first, but I'd like that we avoid to use the idea of duplication as an excuse not to go forward on the building of defense union. I have heard numerous speakers this morning who were saying we need to be careful of duplication between the EU defense union and the NATO, but I mean, let's face it and let's look at it very clearly. This is not the same purpose, this is not the same scale of action, and so I think we should not use this potential excuse of duplication not to go forward. My second remark is on spendings. Indeed, we do not spend the 2% that we should do in the European Union, but the fact is that we all together spend 40% more than the Americans. The question, but we have only 10 to 15% of their capabilities. So the question is, the idea is rather how do we rationalize our spending to be more efficient, to have more capabilities. Today we have 17 different tanks in the EU. We have 20 different air fighters. We've got 29 different ships. So how do we go forward? How we can improve that? Because here is my point of view, the key, the heart of the problem of the defense union. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, now, panelists, we have a few minutes left, and please reflect all these questions in your answers. Perhaps Jüri, you could start first.
Okay. A lot of good questions. Let me take a couple of them. I mean, I think it's clear today that the duplication between NATO and the European Union is very unlikely, because it has become clear again why NATO is necessary. Because of the security situation, it is, I think, understandable to everybody why we need NATO, what are NATO's tasks, and what are tasks which EU, as not a military organization, can never, ever fulfill. And one of them is collective defense. This issue about duplication was a bigger concern when the risks were not so evident. They were very scared. Cold War was over, everybody was friends, people were all friends, so the division of labor was much less clear. And let's be honest, there were politicians who were pushing EU defense as an alternative to NATO defense. It is not something we are just now creating out of thin air. This was the case. But nowadays, I think it is much less likely. And this is obviously very positive. When it comes to input-output measurement, it is absolutely clear that Estonian 2% gives you much less output than, let's say, French 2%. I mean, it's obvious. But I think we should have some kind of a measure to judge the political commitment of nations to properly spend on defense. And 2% is something which actually has been created by NATO as a sort of very approximate calculation, and could therefore easily be used, I believe, also by the European Union. And finally, it is true that we have many different types of ships, tanks, much more than the United States. But let's be honest, the reason is that we are not the United States of Europe. Every country has its internal industrial policy. When you are here, you are all pro-cooperation, etc., etc. But when you go back to your constituencies, the question will be, let's close this military factory because, you know, this other nation is doing it. And then you come to jobs, you know, taxes, etc., etc. So it's not so easy to close the industrial facilities when it comes to defense, particularly because the only client for defense is the state. So you cannot say, oh, the market will take care of it. Yes, you don't have a proper market, so just close the factory. Because your state often has the responsibility to keep that factory open by purchasing those weapons. So again, it's quite complicated to achieve in practice, but again, I believe it can be done, or at least we can move in that direction.
Thank you. Ambassador, your closing remarks, please.
First I start with the question from Mr. Deron. A correction, I'm not Turkish ambassador, but I'm representing NATO, although my national affiliation is with Turkey. I can talk about how NATO-EU cooperation evolved since the time when I served as Turkish ambassador to NATO between 2006 and 2009. And I can tell you that right now there is a sea change in the level of our cooperation. It also relates to change of culture. Mindsets are changing on both sides, and I think it will be all helping us to progress. When it comes to non-EU allies' contributions, and Carl Bildt already referred to substantial contributions by those nations, also referring to Turkey in particular, and they contribute to European security and defense overall, as well as to make significant contributions to the EU's efforts to strengthen its capacities to address complexities of the security environment that we all face. If we need to make progress, we also require to have the strategic partnership between NATO and EU to advance by fully involving non-EU allies in the consultations, in planning, and making their contributions available in a more structured manner. Of course, we need to also see that when we talk about non-EU allies, we should be open-minded and give the possibility to all, since the decisions at NATO are reached on consensus basis, and if a progress has been achieved, it is also thanks to the good contributions of those allies who are in question. Now, a few words on Ms. Paula Ali's comments, and I salute him not only as his national capacity, but also as President of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It is true that NATO is adapting itself in a constant manner, And in dealing with the threats emanating from the south, one clear example is the creation of the hub at the JFC Naples. It was initially started operating on 5th of September, but it will be fully operational by the end of the year. And I think it adds to our capacity to see, to be better aware of what's going on in the region, to make the necessary analysis to equip us with the ways to deal with the challenges. Now, the contributions of nations, as I alluded to earlier briefly, it should not only be with cash, but also with the way commitments and contributions are made to NATO's defense. And it is also in the form of contributing to crisis management operations or missions, and also in capability development. Now, the discussions within the European Union is, of course, something I cannot pass any judgment. But as I said earlier, the input and output ratios are peculiar. And also, I heard and read Madame Mogherini referring to that. 15% of the defense spending of the United States, 40%, and 15% of the defense capabilities of the United States. So whatever you are reflecting within the European Union, we hope that it will strengthen the efficiency in creating a robust output. As I said earlier, stronger European Union also means stronger NATO, which is a welcome development. In any case, I very much support and sympathize the words expressed related to avoidance of duplication. I recall that in one of his interviews, my good friend Jorge Domech from European Defence Agency was telling that it is not possible to avoid duplication 100%. There is good duplication, unnecessary one, but the idea should be, to the extent possible, we prevent it. On defense spending, the trend is positive, and what nations are doing right now, they will be preparing national plans to be submitted to NATO by the end of the year, and defense ministers will be able to review it in their meeting in February.
Thank you, and Carl, your closing remarks, please.
4 brief remarks. First on sort of PESCO and other countries. Others would know this far better than me, but of course that needs to be sorted out. Internally in the EU, the Danes need to sort out where they're going to be in life on these particular issues. Norway is a relevant partner, especially in the maritime domain. UK, as I said, is 1/4 of EU defense spending. Turkey, as was mentioned, is the biggest army that there is in our part of the world. NATO Land Forces Command is in Turkey. I said Turkey is the biggest troop contributor to the biggest EU land operation. And I have to say, having seen it over the years since UN and NATO and EU, Turkish forces have been extremely competent in their contributions in the Balkans, primarily in Bosnia. But exactly how this will be sorted out, I leave that to Jüri and others. Second, I'm all in favor of 2%, but the relevant thing is how you spend the money. And one should look at sort of operationally relevant capabilities. Then we can have an endless debate about what are the operationally relevant capabilities, but that's where it should start. If Germany is now going to go from 1% to 2% of GDP, that's a doubling of defense spending. You can easily waste that money if you don't spend it in the right way. There must be a strategic decision how that is done. Third point, duplication, I wouldn't be worried. EU will not be able to do high-end territorial defense, high-end kinetic warfare territorial defense, up to and including nuclear. I mean, the French are not going to hand over their nukes to Brussels, if I'm not misunderstanding things. So that will remain, and there's a need for the Americans. But below that, there's a wide range of contingencies where the Americans are completely uninterested, but where we Europeans have to be able to do things. And that's what we should focus on. And that is ample scope for doing things there. Fourth, I noticed that no one has so far taken up my offer of 10 euros for knowing which EU country at the moment is responsible for the battle group. And that's an indictment, both of you and of the battle groups, that is equally bad.
Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me thanking our great panelists. And now, just to say our break is going to be for 15 minutes, and please come back for our last session at 11:35 sharp. Thank you.